Thank you very much. Thank you to Joanna Andrusiak and Dr. Artur Markowski for their help in organizing this lecture tonight. Especially Joanna Andrusiak. She was kind enough to mention my book, which is the basis of my talk tonight, and I brought a copy here, so if anyone is interested in just taking a look, you can pass that around while I'm speaking. And it's really been just an honor and a great pleasure for me to be here at POLIN. This is my first visit since the permanent exhibit opened, and it's been just fantastic to see the exhibit as well as all the activities taking place in the building. And it's really as I said, an honor for me to speak as part of this lecture series tied to the temporary exhibit. So I'd like to start today by asking you all to imagine, to imagine the following scene. In the spring of 1917, right after the overthrow of the Tsar in St. Petersburg, okay? So a group of Jewish students and intellectuals have gathered in an apartment in St. Petersburg that some of them share to celebrate this occasion that the Tsar has been overthrown, and to talk about their plans and dreams for establishing a new modern Jewish culture in what they hope will be a newly democratic Russian state. So at this gathering in St. Petersburg, there were several of the figures who would soon become among the founders of the Yiddischer Wissenschaftlicher Institute, the Yiddish Scientific Institute, known by its acronym YIVO. These included the historian Eliyahu Chirikover, the linguist Zelig Kalmanovich, and Max Weinreich, who would become YIVO's most important scholar and administrator. So at this gathering in the spring of 1917, there was a kind of festive party atmosphere cheering the downfall of the Tsar. And in the middle of this party, as one of the guests later recalled, a linguist and literary scholar named Nochem Shtif suddenly got up and interrupted the festivities to give what one person recalled as a, quote, deeply serious speech. Shtif said that there must now be established a Yiddish scholarly academy of the first rank for Yiddish literature, for Yiddish folklore, and for all branches of scholarship that have a direct relationship to Jewish life. So about 8 years later, Shtif realized this dream that he spoke about with the creation of YIVO, which was the first center for scholarship in Yiddish, the traditional vernacular language of European Jewry, and about the history and culture of Yiddish-speaking Jewish communities. So the first question is, why at this moment, when there was so much upheaval and turmoil in Jewish life and in the region in general, when there were so many pressing issues on the agenda in 1917 in the midst of the First World War and the Russian Revolution, why would someone like Shtif say that the most pressing issue to consider is the creation of a Yiddish scholarly academy? So to address this question, I want to first remind us of some background that in the mid and late 19th century, many of the minority groups in Central and Eastern Europe, who were then ruled by the Russian and the Tsarist empires, were developing nationalist movements of their own. And as part of these movements, they set about documenting their own cultures and their own distinct languages and folk traditions. And this was in part because of the nationalist theories of the period based in the thinking of the German theorist Herder, that if a group could show that it possessed its own distinct history and culture, and particularly folk traditions and languages, that this meant that group could claim the status of a nation. And so such documentation could be used to bolster the arguments of a particular group for recognition as a minority group, and potentially even a claim to a state of their own. Now, when these ideas were adopted by Jews in the region, as is often the case in Jewish history, things became a little bit more complicated. First of all, Jews didn't have one distinct territory where they were a majority that they could potentially envision as their homeland. They were, after all, widely dispersed across many countries of the region, as well as in many immigrant communities around the world. Furthermore, Jews had two candidates for the title of national language. There was Hebrew, which was traditionally the language of study and scholarship and prayer associated with an elite. And then there was Yiddish, which was the spoken daily language of most Jews in the region. So this gave rise to kind of two competing strains of Jewish nationalism. Zionists, which were the better known of these two streams of Jewish nationalism, advocated for a Jewish homeland in the Jews' historic homeland in the Middle East, and the revival of Hebrew, which hadn't been spoken in about 2,000 years, as a national language and a daily language. On the other hand, the diaspora nationalists advocated for rights for Jews as a minority group within the countries of Eastern Europe in particular. And they also saw Jews as a secular national group, and they wanted to build up a modern culture in the Yiddish language. So while Yiddish was traditionally looked down upon as a so-called jargon or jargon, a language associated with the uneducated and with women, for diaspora nationalists, it was important as a reflection of Jewish folk culture, a language that reflected the life of everyday, ordinary Jewish men and women. So when YIVO was founded, one of its primary goals was to raise the prestige of Yiddish. They hoped that by documenting the history of the language and all of the contemporary manifestations of Yiddish culture, they would help to win respect for the language, and not only for the language, but this would also help to win respect and recognition for the Jews who spoke the language. Is it? Okay. I'll get to this in 1 second. Yeah. So this goal of YIVO to elevate the status of the Yiddish language had direct political implications because, again, it was seen as bolstering the claim of Jews as a minority group to rights and recognition. So one of the main tasks that YIVO set about was to serve as a kind of language academy, kind of like the Académie Française for French, right? To create standards for Yiddish, to create a unified Yiddish spelling system, as well as to set standard terminology and other rules for the language. So now let's see if this works. Ah, there we go. Okay. So as we can see in this image from the permanent exhibit, this is an image of the Terminological Commission at work, working to document and to standardize Yiddish terminology. You can see this is actually a photo montage by the artist Moshe Vorobeichik, later known as Moshe Raviv, who was trained at the Bauhaus. And it shows members of the Terminological Commission at their work table with a montage in the back of lists of terminology for shoes, parts of shoes. Now, this goal of working to document Yiddish in order to claim rights and recognition for Jews as a minority group became even more important with the creation of the Second Polish Republic. So at the Paris Peace Conference, which ended the First World War, Poland, along with other successor states to the empires of the region, were forced to sign on to a series of minority treaties where they guaranteed certain rights to their national minority populations. And after some discussion, Jews were included as such a national minority group. So diaspora nationalists began this period of the Second Polish Republic in a mood of great optimism because they hoped that these treaties would create a framework where they could set about building a modern Jewish culture in the Yiddish language with the support of the Polish government that would provide a secure base of funding. Now, in fact, these treaties were very rarely enforced, and they were officially abandoned by the Polish government in 1934. But still, at the beginning of the 1920s, at the beginning of this period, these activists, emboldened by this hopeful spirit that came with the birth of the Second Polish Republic, they set about building a whole network of modern secular institutions functioning in Yiddish. And these included newspapers, publishing houses, literary clubs, theaters, all of which you can see wonderful examples of in the permanent exhibit here. Now, for our purposes, probably most notable, most significant, were that they also set about building a whole network of Yiddish secular schools. And these ranged from the earliest ages, from kindergarten through all levels of schools up to the level of high school. You can see here this image from the Realgymnasia in Vilna, which was part of this network. So it ranged in all levels from kindergarten up to teacher training seminaries. And these schools were important not only in their own right, but also because they were designed to educate the first generation of young Jews who would receive a systematic modern education in their mother tongue, in Yiddish, because traditionally Yiddish was the language that people spoke on a day-to-day basis, but it was not a language of formal instruction. And in these schools, all subjects, except for Polish literature and history, which were required subjects, were taught in Yiddish, everything from gym to chemistry, along with Yiddish literature. So for YIVO, these secular Yiddish schools were very important because they saw them as raising a new young generation that would have the educational background to appreciate its work. After all, who would pick up an academic publication, a scholarly journal in Yiddish, right? The graduates of these schools could read such publications. And in addition, they were also imbued in these schools with a dedication to the ideals of diaspora nationalism, with the idea of the value of this kind of modern Yiddish culture. At the same time, the activists of the schools saw YIVO as crucial to their work because they saw it as the equivalent of a Yiddish university, an institution that would complete what one called the higher rungs on the pedagogical ladder, so that students could receive an education all the way through the university and graduate level in Yiddish. And this is nicely captured in this quote at the bottom of the screen here from the permanent exhibit. This is an image of students from the Realgymnasia visiting an exhibit at YIVO, okay? So you can see here nicely the interaction between YIVO and the secular schools. So in this way, YIVO became not just an institution that served a small group of scholars, but the apex of a whole network of cultural institutions, what one supporter called, quote, the crown of the building of secular Yiddish culture. Now, another factor that made YIVO's work seem particularly important in this period was also related to wider developments in Europe in this period, the fact that by the late 19th century, many groups were interested in documenting their folk cultures and their histories precisely because they feared that in an era of rapid change with urbanization and secularization, that folk traditions were dying out and were not being documented. So in the Jewish context, a kind of landmark came in 1891 with the historian and theoretician of diaspora nationalism, Simon Dubnov, issuing a famous call to collect and protect documents important to the study of Jewish history in Eastern Europe. He lamented the fact that important documents were just, as we say in Yiddish, zersäten, zerspreit, scattered and dispersed, and people didn't know about them and didn't have access to them, and he was afraid that the record of Jewish history could be lost or destroyed. And of course, these concerns became much more pressing with the period of the First World War and its huge impact on the region. And so in the spring of 1917, as we recall, Stiff and his colleagues talked about creating a Jewish scholarly institute like YIVO in Russia. It soon became apparent that this was not going to be possible, as Russia was overtaken not only by the Bolshevik Revolution, but also by the Civil War. And so many of these Yiddish activists were forced to flee, first to Ukraine, where many of them settled for a few years when independent Ukraine promised a wide-ranging autonomy to Jews as a national minority group. But then Ukraine was also engulfed in waves of violence with the pogroms there, leading to further concerns about the destruction of Jewish culture and also, of course, concerns for physical safety, so that many of the people in this photo a few years later moved again and settled in Berlin. So it was in Berlin in the fall of 1924 that Stiff returned to this dream that he spoke of at this party in 1917 and set about trying to found this institution. So he composed a detailed memorandum called On a Yiddish Academic Institute, where he laid out in detail the kind of blueprint that YIVO would, to a large extent, adopt. So he laid out a plan for 4 sections. The largest was the philological section, which dealt with Yiddish language, literature, and folklore. There was also a historical section, and then 2 sections that dealt more with contemporary issues in Jewish life, one for economics and statistics, and one for psychology and pedagogy. So once this plan was kind of laid out by Stiff in this document, the question arose, where should this institution be located? After all, as I've mentioned, right, Yiddish-speaking Jews were living over a widely dispersed area, and at this point they also had not only large communities across Europe, but also immigrant communities from everywhere from Palestine and South Africa to North and South America. So, in fact, one of the functions of YIVO was to serve as a center for Yiddish culture, to serve as a kind of focal point for Yiddish activists and scholars, a kind of national institution for Yiddish-speaking Jews who saw themselves as a secular nation, but who didn't have a state of their own and didn't have an official capital. So when Stiff wrote his memorandum, he proposed Berlin as the seat of YIVO. This is where he was currently residing, and of course Berlin was already well established as a capital of European culture. And interestingly, YIVO's earliest founders and supporters agreed with this choice. But it soon became clear that Stiff's plans for fundraising and for gathering support were not going as he had envisioned. So he contacted leaders in Yiddish-speaking communities in different parts of the world, most notably in Berlin and in New York. But he was soon disappointed by the, at best, kind of lukewarm response that he got. And he saw that the communities in Western Europe and in the United States could not really serve as the backbone of YIVO's support. Now, the one exception to this pattern of disappointment was when he sent his memorandum to Vilna, and it was immediately embraced enthusiastically by a group of local activists, many of whom were associated with the Yiddish secular schools, and led by the scholar Max Weinreich, who, as I mentioned, became YIVO's most important figure in the interwar period, and also the linguist Zalman Rezen. So, in the interwar period, as I'm sure you know, right, Vilna is today Vilnius, the capital of Lithuania, but at this period it was Vilno in Poland. And it had a long history as a center of Jewish culture and scholarship, going back to traditional rabbinic scholarship as embodied in the figure of the Vilner Gaon, and continuing through the Haskalah, the Jewish Enlightenment movement. And in the interwar period, Vilna became the site of arguably the greatest flowering of secular Yiddish culture. So, for example, there were more students enrolled in these Yiddish secular schools in Vilna than in Warsaw, even though the Jewish community of Warsaw was about 5 times as large in this period. As the linguist Noach Perlitsky put it, Yiddish itself is recognized as a territory, the anarchic republic with its seat in Vilna. YIVO is the scholarly academy of the territory Yiddish. So when I prepared this lecture, I didn't know the whole museum had been designed just to illustrate my talk, but you can see that it works very well. So given this, it's perhaps not surprising that by the spring of 1926, the so-called headquarters of YIVO in Berlin had virtually shut down, whereas the branch in Vilna had already produced the Institute's first scholarly publication and was already building its collections. And this question of where the headquarters should be located, interestingly, was not officially decided, and there was a lot of resistance to officially establishing Vilna as the headquarters, but the whole question became moot by 1928 when supporters in Vilna purchased a plot of land with 2 buildings on it and set about renovating one of them to serve as the YIVO headquarters. This building was located in a relatively new area of the city, a short walk away from the historic Jewish quarter, which was renowned by this period, but which was also quite old and run down and impoverished. And this building was located in a newer neighborhood that still had a lot of open green space and was laid out with broad, straight streets. And moreover, observers put a lot of weight on this green setting surrounded by open space and also by the building's up-to-date facilities, all of which reinforced the impression of Yiddish culture as something that was very much modern. So the historian Lucy Davidovich, who came from New York to Vilna to study for a year at YIVO right before the outbreak of the Second World War, recalled this building in her memoirs. She wrote, quote, "Everything about YIVO, its location, its landscape setting, its modern design, the gleaming immaculateness of the place, delivered a message. YIVO was no seedy relic of the past, it belonged to the future." So when YIVO's leaders spoke about the mission of their work, the one phrase that was used most often was that their goal was to serve the folk, meaning the masses of ordinary Yiddish-speaking Jews. So the question arises, if YIVO was an organization dedicated to these relatively arcane questions like standardizing the Yiddish spelling system, right, and carrying out its scholarly research tasks, how could this work be relevant to the broad Jewish public? Well, one way that YIVO saw itself as fulfilling this mission was by studying the folk itself. And this was very much in keeping with the approach of Simon Dubnov, who in his approach to historical research stressed the everyday life of ordinary Jews as opposed to focusing on elites, communal leaders, great rabbis, and so forth. Now, the most famous example of this is the work of YIVO's Ethnographic Commission, which I'll say more about in a few minutes. But first of all, before we even get to this question of studying the folk, an earlier question arose of how could YIVO go about doing this? Because as Dubnov had already recognized in 1891, to carry out research, scholars first need a body of material that's accessible to them. They need the sources, the documents, the data that they can use to carry out their studies. And since YIVO was such a small institution that had a very limited and uncertain budget, how could it create such collections? So to solve this dilemma, it again turned to the folk itself. It appealed to ordinary individuals to become what were known as sammlers, or collectors, and to gather material wherever they lived in their hometowns throughout the world. And again, we see this very nicely illustrated in the core exhibit here with this kind of interactive screen showing the work of the sammlers. So, as I mentioned, the work of the Ethnographic Committee and their appeals to collect folklore were the most successful and probably the best well-known. It's worth mentioning that these Sammlers gathered a whole range of materials that built YIVO's collections literally from scratch. So they collected bibliographic citations for the Bibliographic Commission. They collected terminology for the Terminological Commission, as we saw. They collected historical documents and current-day statistics for the economic, for the other sections. And the response to these appeals quickly exceeded all expectations that YIVO leaders had for their collecting campaigns. So by March of 1926, the Ethnographic Commission had already received 3,000 items of folklore, and by 1929, it had accessioned over 50,000 items of folklore, and at that time there were 163 Sammlerkreisen, or collector circles, operating primarily, and this was the area with the strongest base of YIVO support, in the city of Vilna and the surrounding regions of eastern Poland and the Baltics, what's known in Jewish geography sometimes as Lita, which is much larger than contemporary Lithuania, but really includes that whole region of eastern Poland and then modern-day Baltic states and Belarus. In addition, should mention that collectors and collecting groups were active wherever Yiddish-speaking Jews had settled. So YIVO received submissions from far away as from Palestine and Argentina, Canada and Johannesburg, really all over the world. Now, in addition to collecting all kinds of materials for YIVO's work, the Sammlers also played an important role in collecting funds to support it financially. Because as I've mentioned, part of the impetus for the founding of YIVO and other modern Yiddish cultural institutions and educational institutions in this period was the expectation that the Polish national government would help provide funding under the terms of the minority treaties, but in fact, this was very rarely the case. So for a number of years, a majority of YIVO's budget was supplied by individuals and organizations in the United States, at least until the onset of the Great Depression. But even so, the amounts of money that the founders and the leaders of YIVO were able to amass in this way was only a small percentage of what Stiff outlined in his original memorandum. So another strategy that the Institute used was to turn to this grassroots network of supporters as embodied in the Sammlers, and argued that since Yiddish-speaking Jews constituted, in their view, a kind of nation, but a nation without a state, right? So for most nations, they have a government that levies taxes, and part of your tax dollars go to support public schools, the National Library, and so forth. But since Yiddish-speaking Jews didn't have a government of their own, they needed to rely on a kind of voluntary tax that supporters would pay to help finance what took really the place, in their view, of a Yiddish language academy, Yiddish university, and Yiddish National Library. So as the historian Eliyahu Cherikover put it, quote, "We have become the folk's Ministry of Education. The folk must become our Ministry of Finance." And in fact, large numbers of supporters did respond to these kinds of appeals. It's interesting that also a number of kehilas, of organized Jewish communal authorities in a number of cities and towns throughout Poland, also voted annual subsidies to support YIVO. And even more interestingly, a number of local Polish governments also voted subsidies on occasion. But still, given the general impoverishment in Poland in this period, however important symbolically this support was, in actual financial terms, the amounts that were raised in this way were quite small. So just to give you an example, in 1931, YIVO's budget showed that it had received donations from many different groups of Jews throughout Eastern Europe. Just for example, in the city of Grodno, a group of manual laborers, printers, and local hairdressers all donated to YIVO. But all of these donations combined came to about 1% of YIVO's total budget. But still, these were seen as very important statements of support on a symbolic level. And I would say that given the poverty of many of these people who did donate, their dedication to the Institute was all the more remarkable. So the 1929 survey that I mentioned before showed that over a third of the Zondlers were manual laborers or small merchants. And some of them wrote to YIVO asking for money or for stamps so that they could afford to buy paper, record, let's say, the folklore that they were gathering, and then to mail it to Vilna. And we see this also in this letter, which is featured in the exhibit by a Zomler who was actually in Tel Aviv at the time and wanted to send his collection to YIVO. And he wrote, quote, "As my material situation is not good and it is difficult for me to bear the burden, I am forced against my will to ask you to take part in the expense." So these individuals often faced poverty and anti-Semitism in their day-to-day lives, but I think their dedication shows that they did believe that through their work for YIVO, they could contribute in some way to a great cultural undertaking. As one of them put it, "With joy, I proclaim myself a porter of clay, sand, and brick for the palace of the people called the Yiddish Scientific Institute." And again, I was very happy to see this quote in the exhibit after I had prepared my talk. I think this illustrates, very nicely the points that I'm making. So for YIVO, this goal of serving the folk meant studying ordinary Jews and working alongside in partnership with ordinary Jews in its work, but also producing research that would somehow be of interest and relevance to the lives of ordinary Jews. So for example, the economic statistical section focused on contemporary problems which were very much on the agenda in this period, such as migration and employment patterns. But interestingly, members of the historical section also argued that their research, even their historical research, had an important role to play in relating to the present-day concerns of Jews and Poles in the Second Polish Republic. So, for example, Emanuel Ringelblum, you see here on the upper left, one of the pillars of the historical section, said that Jewish historians could contribute to the improvement of Polish-Jewish relations in this way. Quote, "When the Jewish academic presents completely objective work, even about the distant past, before Polish academics and future high school teachers, he thereby brings the Jewish and Polish communities closer together." So while YIVO felt it was important to be engaged in contemporary issues, at the same time, it always insisted on maintaining a distance from direct involvement in the political questions of the day. And of course, this was a period when a whole range of Jewish political movements were very, very active. And so maintaining this balance between nonpartisanship, as YIVO leaders termed it, and engagement with contemporary issues proved a very difficult balance to strike, and a tension that lasted from the very founding of YIVO all the way through its history. So while YIVO's leaders described their institution as nonpartisan, as I've described, clearly its roots lay in diaspora nationalism. And moreover, a certain group of YIVO supporters were socialists who largely affiliated with one of two Jewish socialist parties in this period, the Jewish Labor Bund, or the left wing of the Socialist Zionist Party, Poale Zion. And these people often pressed YIVO to more openly embrace socialist causes and ally itself with socialist institutions. Now, YIVO's leaders consistently rejected these calls. They saw its stance of nonpartisanship as one of the keystones of its work as an institute devoted to objective research. But to critics on the left, this was a kind of abandonment of YIVO's core mission to serve the folk, because as socialists, they saw the folk in class terms essentially as meaning the working class, and argued that only socialist parties really represented the interests of the ordinary workers. Now, while these debates played out within the Institute among YIVO supporters, of course, there was a whole range of external critics who were even more critical of YIVO's work. So just to put YIVO in a kind of broader perspective for a moment, we should keep in mind that just a few months before YIVO began its work in the fall of 1925, the Hebrew University of Jerusalem was founded by Jews committed to Zionism. And at the same time, in the Soviet Union, there were created Jewish academies in the cities of Minsk and Kiev, where Jewish scholars conducted their research in Yiddish with the full support of the Soviet government. So at the same time, there were also Orthodox institutions founded, like the Yeshivas Chokmei Lublin, that were rooted in a traditional definition of Jewish scholarship of rabbinic texts. And here in Warsaw, there was the Instytut Naukowego, which was carrying out its work in Polish and Hebrew. So YIVO was operating in this period alongside a number of other institutions devoted to Jewish scholarship rooted in a whole range of competing worldviews. And this led to a whole range of tensions, which I won't go into now, but just to mention that YIVO was sometimes attacked for its supposed hostility to Zionism and the Hebrew language, which it denied. YIVO attacked the Instytut Naukowego, which it saw as an assimilationist because of its use of the Polish language. Its closest relationships in the first years were with the academies in the Soviet Union. After all, they were carrying out their research in Yiddish and often on similar topics, researching the Yiddish language and Yiddish literature. And moreover, for a time, YIVO scholars looked enviously to the Soviet Union, because here was a country where the government was supporting the work of its national minorities and research in national minority languages, including Yiddish, which what seemed like, you know, their dream come true, what they had hoped the minority treaties would lead to, at least on a more modest scale. But of course, within just a few years, as the Soviet Union's policies changed and such support evaporated, and moreover, it became increasingly repressive, these relationships ended, and the Soviet example came to be a kind of warning for the dangers of direct political involvement in scholarship. So after a few years of energetic work, YIVO celebrated its great successes with its first international conference in October 1929. This photo is from its second international conference a few years later. But only days after YIVO's first conference came the Wall Street crash. And with that, the basis of its funding from American sources was really greatly diminished, and then within a short time, the impact of the Great Depression was felt in Poland as well. So between this new financial situation as well as the greater than expected costs of renovating its headquarters building, the Institute was brought very close to the brink of bankruptcy in the early 1930s. So it's all the more remarkable that by the mid-1930s, YIVO's work was recovering its impetus and, in fact, exploring new avenues for research. It created an art section that was inaugurated at the 1935 convention with an exhibit of drawings by Marc Chagall. And it fulfilled the last major element that Stiff had outlined in his original memorandum with the creation of a program known as the Aspirantur. So this was much more modest than the Yiddish university that the founders had originally spoken of, but it was a program that trained a small number of advanced students in the areas of YIVO's research, more or less the equivalent of a graduate program. And symbolically, this was also important because it finally completed that so-called pedagogical ladder, because now, at least in principle, a student could receive a modern education in Yiddish all the way up to the level of graduate training. In the same year, in 1934, Max Weinreich established another division of the Institute that grew out of his growing interest in social science disciplines that were kind of cutting edge in this period, specifically sociology and psychology, and he created the Division of Youth Research. And this division brought what was then this cutting-edge scholarship to an interdisciplinary approach to studying the problems of Jewish youth. And this, of course, was at a time by the mid and late 1930s of growing unemployment and anti-Semitism, when many young people were apprehensive about their future path in Poland. And most famously, the Division of Youth Research organized a series of autobiography contests where it called on adolescents and youth to record their life stories, send them to YIVO, and then it awarded prizes for the winning entries. And hundreds of responses were submitted as part of these contests, over 600 altogether. And these autobiographies created a unique data set that today is really unmatched as a resource for historians, because it provides a kind of candid look at the everyday life of young people, something that could never be replicated, after the Holocaust. And this collection has become, I would say, probably the single most used and researched collection at YIVO because of its value. So we see here, one autobiography with a particularly nicely designed cover, and then we can see here that it's also featured with several others in the permanent exhibit. And I was really quite moved to see how extensively these autobiographies were mined for the exhibit as sources in a whole variety of formats in the permanent exhibit. These are just a few examples. Okay. So while these autobiographies have obviously become a priceless resource for historians, I want to point out that they also served a very important purpose in the 1930s as well, at the time that they were written. Because like the calls to Sammlers, the autobiography contests made use of YIVO's technique of involving ordinary Jews in its work. And through this method, it sent a very powerful message to young Jews in this time when many of them felt a sense of apprehension and perhaps hopelessness about their future path. They told these young people that their own experiences were valuable and were important for the further development of Jewish culture. So in this difficult period, by the late 1930s, as political conditions were worsening in Europe, and movements on the right and the left of the political spectrum were gaining strength, the calls for YIVO to affiliate with the socialist movement only became stronger with the rise of fascism as a looming threat. But in this period, YIVO's leaders maintained that their stance of political neutrality was particularly valuable, that it was more valuable than ever in a period of political extremism, because only through rigorous, nonpartisan scholarship could one amass objective research and empirical data that could then be used to accurately assess historical and contemporary problems that were facing Polish Jews in this period. So rather than a kind of luxury in a period of crisis, YIVO's leaders saw scholarship as more pressing than ever. Simon Dubnov asked rhetorically whether one stopped studying geology during an earthquake. And the linguist Yudel Mark compared YIVO to, quote, a lighthouse in the rough seas of our bitter present, So in the late 1930s, YIVO renewed its commitment to working for the folk. It devoted even more attention to pressing contemporary issues that would resonate with the Jewish public. So, for example, it founded a new journal based in the economic statistical section that promised to study problems like Jewish migration, quote, not with prepared social schemes or with ready political ideologies, but by providing comprehensive, objective, verified material about the life of the masses. And YIVO leaders also argued that scholarship could help maintain morale and help to fight for Jewish dignity in this period. So the historian Isaiah Trunk published a history of medieval Polsce in 1939, and he wrote about its contemporary relevance. Quote, this book appears at a time when the rights of the Jewish population of Poland are disputed, at a time when reactionaries consider Polish Jews who have lived in the country for centuries as foreigners. This book shows that Jews are no foreigners in Poland who arrived yesterday. So it was with this sense of determination that YIVO's scholars faced the future in this uncertain period. In 1938, Weinreich expressed a sense of foreboding when he mused at a YIVO meeting, quote, what will be later? We do not know. The skies are so overcast with clouds. It is possible that later we will consider our time as the good years. Yet he concluded, quote, I believe that YIVO can serve as an example of what can still be created in such storms. We will resist and overcome to spite all our enemies. So to conclude now, of course, YIVO's work could not hold off the catastrophe that would soon engulf European Jewry. And moreover, as I've discussed today, even during this period of the interwar years of the Second Polish Republic, which were later remembered as the good years, YIVO could only accomplish a small portion of what its leaders originally set out to do. And while it sometimes described itself as a national institution that represented all 11 million Yiddish-speaking Jews in the world, it could never satisfy its critics who saw it as anti-Zionist or insufficiently socialist. And so I think its history demonstrates both the possibilities and pitfalls of combining scholarship and nationalism, culture and politics, objectivity and engagement. YIVO's birth came shortly after the birth of the Second Polish Republic itself, at a time when Jews hoped that the minority treaties would create a framework to build a modern secular culture in Yiddish. And although the goal of government support proved illusory, YIVO's leaders were able to capitalize on its thousands of supporters across Poland and throughout the world to assemble what are today still the world's largest collections on East European Jewish history and culture, and which are still being mined today by researchers, as we can see so richly demonstrated in the exhibit in this building. So while it served a constituency of students and scholars, YIVO also became the center of a mass movement that demonstrated how scholarship can serve as a powerful tool for creating a modern identity. Thank you all very much. Okay.
Are there any questions? Można też zadawać pytania po polsku, jeśli Państwo chcą.
What was the fate of the archives?
Translating in Polish. If you from Polish. Okay. All right. Thank you.
What's the story of how the archives were? How the archives survived? Did they survive? Were they transported through Lithuania, or what was the path of?
Yes. Well, that's a very interesting question. The history of Vilna during the Second World War is a little bit complicated because the Soviets came in at the start of war, then they left, and they turned the city of Vilna over to Lithuania, which was independent. So YIVO continued its activity for about a year. And then the Soviets came in for about a year. And at that point, YIVO was kind of lost its independence, but its collections were still intact up to that point. But when the Nazis invaded they began ransacking all of the libraries and collections in the area, as was their policy across Europe. And the YIVO building itself became a gathering place for this looted material and a sorting center where a number of scholars, including Zelig Kalmanovich, who is one of the leaders of YIVO, were forced to go through YIVO's own collections as well as other materials that had been brought there, with the idea that the most valuable material would be sent to Germany for the museum that the Nazis planned to establish after they had eradicated the Jewish people. And the rest, the vast majority, was to be destroyed. So a group of the workers that were working under the Nazis formed what was known, what came to be known by the nickname of the Paper Brigade, the Papierbrigade, and they set about trying to save some of this material, either by hiding it in the YIVO building, smuggling it back into the ghetto when they returned to the ghetto at night, or by handing it over to non-Jewish contacts for safekeeping. And there's a book by David Fishman that was recently published that tells this story in great detail. It's called The Book Smugglers. Now, at the end of the war, a small amount of hidden material was recovered. The YIVO building itself was destroyed, and all of its contents were destroyed during a bombing. The material that had been shipped to Germany, ironically, was discovered by the Allied armies in a depot and was eventually returned to YIVO in New York. And also a small amount of material that was hidden by a group led by the poets and members of the partisan movement, Shmerke Kaczerginski and Avram Sutzkever. They recovered what material they could that they had hidden after the war and smuggled it out and brought it to New York. And it was assumed for the next 40 years that everything else had been destroyed. But with the period of perestroika, it became known that there was a lot of material that in fact had survived, and it was off limits in the Soviet times, but the head of the library where this material was did not destroy it. He simply kind of locked the door to the where it was kept, and it was out of sight. But with the end of the Soviet Union, it became known that there was more archival material that in fact had survived. And there were negotiations about returning that material to YIVO in New York, which did not happen. But within the last few years, YIVO, which relocated to New York in 1940, reached an agreement with the Lithuanian government to preserve the material and to make it available online, so that some of this material is now being processed and cared for, and eventually will be available. The originals will physically remain in Vilnius, but they'll be available through the miracle of the internet, right, to scholars all over the world. So it's still an ongoing story even today, and you can read more about this on the website of YIVO, if you're interested.
So a large percentage of it survived, and the Russian part, the Soviet part, is in Vilna right now. That's what you're saying.
Yes. I mean, not everything survived, but more survived than people had realized until, you know, the end of the Soviet Union.
Remarkable.
Yes. Thank you. Oh. Okay. Okay. Let me. Yeah, I have to put on these headphones because otherwise I won't understand. Okay. Yes, yes, okay. Okay.
Projekt oświatowy YIVO, o którym Pani opowiedziała, jest fantastyczny, bo jednoczył Żydów mieszkających w różnych krajach. Ale mam pytanie odwrotne. Do jakiego życia przygotowywano w tych krajach Żydów w tym projekcie oświatowym? Zatem, czy YIVO odpowiadało na pytanie, jaki ma być współczesny Żyd mieszkający w Rosji, w Polsce, gdzieś tam w innym kraju, z czego miał żyć, jak miał się tam zaadaptować, jak realizować swoje życie w środowisku Jiddisz, prawda? Bo to tak wyglądało. Czy można odpowiedzieć na takie pytanie? Stawianie sobie takie pytanie.
Yeah. Yes. Well, thank you. Thank you. That's a very interesting question. I think there's two ways to consider this kind of question. One is in practical terms, and one is in kind of ideological terms, symbolic terms, let's say. Because the aspirantur program that I mentioned succeeded in training a number of scholars who were really very well versed in Yiddish folklore, Yiddish literature, and other areas. So you could say that in intellectual terms, the program was a success. It educated a small number of Jews on a very high level where they could have taken up, say, university positions. But on a practical level, there weren't such positions available, right? So Ringelblum, for example, spoke out one time. He opposed the expansion of the aspirantur program because he said, where will graduates of the aspirantur be employed? Where can they get jobs, right? There aren't university positions for Jewish scholars in Poland, okay? So one problem with this vision of education in Yiddish through all levels is that it had important ideological implications for people who were committed to developing Yiddish culture on a high level, but in practical terms, it didn't prepare young Jews for careers. So for example, the diploma of the Realgymnasia was not accepted by the university. So there were a number of graduates of this prestigious institution who had to go and get a kind of second high school diploma in order to study at the university in Vilna because their diploma was not recognized. So many parents couldn't afford tuition to send their students to a private Jewish school, and even if they wanted to, they recognized that they needed an advanced degree from a Polish institution to make a kind of professional career. So there was that consideration that really limited the, say, the usefulness in practical terms of this education in Yiddish. So I think on an ideological level, the schools trained their students, both at YIVO and in the lower level Yiddish secular schools, to be proud of Jewish culture, to see Jewish culture as something that was modern and European, that it was part of being, it was an education to be part of modern European culture. I don't know who chose the illustration that accompanied my lecture, but it was interesting that it shows an older man and a child reading a Yiddish translation of Sienkiewicz. So they're not reading Sholem Aleichem or a Jewish author, they're reading a Yiddish translation of a Polish classic, right? And I think that's very interesting because it shows that these students were getting the message that Jewish culture was something very rich and something they should be proud of and something that they could participate in the modern world, in Polish society and in European society as Jews. And they didn't have to choose between being modern and being Jewish. But at the same time, as I've said, there were also practical considerations that limited the extent to which this vision could be realized. I hope that answers your question. Yeah. Okay.
Are there any more questions?
Okay.
Is there any link between Isaac Bashevis Singer and YIVO? Were there contacts? He is the symbol of what Yiddish language could be on the literature in the world. So did he have any personal contact? So was he a different generation, so to speak, or?
Well, as far as I know, in the period that I spoke about, in the interwar period, I don't know of any contacts. I mean, of course, Bashevis left in the early 30s, I think, but there were contacts between other Yiddish writers and YIVO. It's interesting that out of all the different areas that YIVO studied, it studied Jewish literature in the period of the Haskalah, the Jewish Enlightenment, and so forth. But it didn't have any section or group devoted to studying contemporary Yiddish literature, which of course was blossoming at this time. And it's interesting to consider why. Perhaps just the way they didn't want to get too closely involved in politics, perhaps they didn't want to get involved in writing about, critical assessments of contemporary literature because they didn't perhaps want to antagonize particular writers. I don't know, but that's my speculation. So there were definitely writers that were, Yiddish writers that were involved in YIVO. So the 1935 convention had, not as part of the convention, but kind of as a, I don't know, well, sort of attached to it, a kind of showcase for Yiddish literature. But there wasn't, interestingly, there wasn't a kind of direct venue for contemporary novelists or poets to really take part in YIVO's work. Okay.
Anyone else? Okay, if not, thank you very much for a great
thanks
lecture.
to all of you. Yes, thank you. Thank you.